Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good Tvach, Shvat Tov. We are learning Mishnah Beitza, Perek Beis, Chapter 2, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. Shlosh Devarim. There are three things. Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah mater, where the sage Rebbe ben Azariah permitted, the Chachamim Eisrin, but the Chachamim forbade. The first example is Parasa Yaitza B'Ratzua Shabein Karneha. Literally translated, it means his cow, which would sound like the cow of Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah, went out with a strap between its horns in a public domain. Now, the same way you cannot carry things on Shabbos in a public domain, your animal can't do that either. Except that if, let's say, we consider what the animal has on it as part of its gear, so to speak, something that it typically has on it, it's sort of kind of like it's clothing of sorts, then we say that it's not a problem of carrying, just like our clothing. So the issue was this strap that was put between the horns. Now, what was that strap doing there? It was considered, or the person who put it there, for ornamental purposes, some kind of ornamental purpose. But it really wasn't anything majorly ornamental. It wasn't your typical kind of ornament. No, it wasn't about that. It was about putting it there as an ornament between the horns. And it was not your usual ornament. So Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah said it's permissible to do it because he considered it an ornament. The Chachamim forbade it because they didn't consider it an ornament, and therefore the animal was carrying something in a public domain on Shabbos. Now, an interesting thing that the Bartanura points out is that the Gemara says that this cow was not the cow that belonged to Lezer ben Azariah. It wasn't his cow that he allowed to go out with that strap, but rather it was like his neighbors, who he saw it being done, and he let it go. And because of the fact that he let it go, the Mishnah gives him the credit for it, because being that he didn't protest against it, the Mishnah calls it parasai. The Mishnah calls it his cow. Okay, now that's the first halacha. Umekardin asabehema b'yantif. Mekardin means to curry. What does curry mean? It means to scratch and scrape the body of an animal. Okay, now this, when you talk about mekardin, I got the word right. Mekardin, it's talking about using a fine-toothed metal comb. That's what you're using. Okay. Now, according to Rebbe Azariah, you could use this comb to, let's call it, to scratch the animal, even though the sharp teeth of the comb might prick the animal and make it bleed. Causing something to bleed on Shabbos is forbidden, or Yontif is forbidden, because of the malacha of shchita, of slaughtering. Okay. Now, Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah, although there was a possibility that it was going to prick the animal, cause it to bleed, Lezer ben Azariah said it's permissible. Why? Because it wasn't intended. It's called davar she'eino miskaven, something that's not intended. You don't intend to cause the animal to bleed. It happens unintentionally. Okay, so even though it could happen in your act, but if it does happen, since it was done unintentionally, therefore, according to Ben Azariah, it's mutter. That's called davar she'eino miskaven mutter. Okay, now we're going to see that the Chachamim are going to forbid that, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about why. But right now, let's just see what Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah holds. Lezer ben Azariah said you can scrape the animal because of the fact that if you land up a prick, causing it to bleed, it was davar she'eino miskaven, it was unintended. V'sheichekin es hapilpolim b'reichaim shalahem. And he also wrote that you may grind pilpulin or peppercorns in the small grinders that were made for grinding them. Okay, now, let me read to you how they explain this here. Even though the malach of grinding could be prohibited on Yontif, in his view, this type of grinding on a small scale using household utensils is not included in the prohibition of grinding on Yontif. The sages disagree with Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah. Okay, now, before we get into Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah, so what's happening here is that he said you could go ahead and grind the peppercorns in these grinders. Now, when we talk about and we say that whether grinding is going to be prohibited or not, if we're talking about grinding pepper, right, which is something that you need it for Yontif, it's eichel nefesh, something you use for food, and it's something that could actually lose its flavor, right? Mm-hmm. Then you can do it on Yontif. So therefore, Rabbi ben Azariah said, and you could go ahead and you could grind it. You could grind it, but you got to. Rabbi ben Azariah, the chiddush of Rabbi ben Azariah is what's now about Rabbi ben Azariah is the fact he said you could do it b'reichaim shalahem in their small grinder, meaning there was a grinder that was specifically for grinding peppercorns. And Rabbi ben Azariah said if you're going to grind on Yontif, you can grind it even using its regular grinder. Now, when we explain the Chachamim, we'll see what exactly the Chacham had a problem with this. So let me read to you here how they explain the Chachamim. The sages disagree with Elizabeth and Azariah. In their view, a cow may not be allowed to go into a public domain with decorative ribbon because it's not considered an item of clothing. We explained that before, right? The Chacham not consider this ribbon as a regular way of ornamenting the animal. It's not considered like the clothing of the animal. Therefore, you cannot go ahead and you can't let the animal go out like that. They prohibited using the fine-tooth metal comb because it may cause the animal to bleed. It's unintended. But we know there is a machlokes Tanoim if davashan miskaven is mutter or usser. If you do malacha unintentionally, is it permissible or not? When it's not considered a malacha or not. Rabbi Shimon holds davashan miskaven doing a malacha unintentionally is not considered doing a malacha. Rabbi Yehuda holds it is. So what really boils down here is that Elazar ben Azariah was following Rabbi Shimon's opinion when he said, since you because of the bleed, it's unintended, it's therefore mutter to go ahead and scratch the animal with this metal tooth comb. And the Chachamim said, Davashan miskaven is aser. A malacha done intentionally is forbidden. And therefore they said they can't do it. Now, an important thing to point out is even according to Reb Shimon, if you do a malacha and a malacha, you do an act, and a malacha results unintended from it. But if it falls under the category of a psik reisha, which means it's inevitable that's going to happen, then even Reb Shimon holds, even though it's unintended, it's forbidden. So apparently, this kind of scraping the animal with this metal comb was not a psik reisha. It wasn't inevitable to cause it to bleed. It could cause it to bleed. But since it's not a psik reisha, Reb Shimon says it would be permissible. That's why Elazar ben Azariah allowed you to use the comb to do that, while the Chachamim forbade it because they're following Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that says an unintentional malacha is considered a forbidden act on Shabbos. Okay. Now, at the same time, let's say instead of using this metal comb, you used a wooden comb. Okay, they used to have actually we'll speak about that in the next part of the Mishnah. Okay, I'm jumping the gun. Okay, and when it came to go ahead and grinding the peppercorns in their regular grinder, the Chachamim forbade it because it's considered uvda d'chol. It's considered a weekday activity. Doing it in that manner, even though it's essentially it would be permissible to grind the pepper. Nonetheless, if you do it in its regular grinder, then it already becomes like a weekday activity. Now, they bring down here, the sages forbid only the use of a pepper grinder. They allow one to grind peppercorns with a mortar and a pestle, as well as other spices. Meaning, if you do it in that manner, which is not your regular manner of doing it, then it's not considered a problem of the whole weekday activity. It's using the peppercorn grinder that falls under that category. Okay. So now we have the reasons behind the machlokes between Elazar ben Azariah and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says, you cannot scrape the animal with the metal comb because of the fact that it makes a wound, or it could make a wound. Aval mekartzefin, but you could do something that's called mekartzef. What is that? That's when you curry the animal with a blunt-toothed wooden comb. It's not that sharp.
Not that sharp.
And therefore, it's not going to cause it to bleed. Yeah. So if you want to use that kind of a thing to scratch the animal, scrape the animal, that's okay, Rabbi Yehuda says. The Chachamim say, Ein mekarden afloi mekartzefin. You can't do either of them. Whether it's a metal one or it's a wooden one, you can't do it. The reason why the Chachamim say even the wooden one you can't use is because if we allow to use the wooden one, people may get mixed up and they'll end up using the metal one, and that would be problematic. So therefore, the Chachamim said you cannot do any of these acts of scraping of the animal.
Why?
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I didn't get the, why are you scratching the